The military working dog slammed its paws against the stainless steel exam table, ignoring every command its handler shouted. Stay. Nothing. Down. Nothing. The room tightened with alarm as the Belgian Malinois twisted away from the line for the third time, its breathing sharp, its ears pinned back, every muscle ready to bolt despite the injury wrapped beneath its tactical vest. If they couldn't stabilize the dog within minutes, the emergency surgery scheduled upstairs would be delayed, and an entire chain of military evidence tied to a classified operation could be compromised. Around the treatment bay, veterinarians, security officers, and hospital staff froze between urgency and hesitation. Then, without warning, someone whispered, "Keep that nurse away from him." Every pair of eyes turned toward the quiet woman who had just stepped through the doorway carrying nothing more than fresh saline and a clipboard. Emma Carter stopped walking. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She simply looked at the dog. For one impossible second, the growling stopped. Nobody noticed her lowering the clipboard onto a nearby counter. Nobody noticed the subtle shift in her breathing. They only noticed the silence. The Malinois stared directly at her, its body still tense, yet no longer fighting the room. "Miss Carter," one veterinarian snapped, breaking the spell. "Step back immediately." She obeyed without argument, taking a slow step away instead of forward. The instant she moved, the dog exploded back into frantic resistance, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered across the polished floor. Two handlers struggled to steady the animal while alarms chirped from a disconnected monitor. A technician muttered under his breath, "What was that?" No one answered because no one had one. The chief veterinarian rubbed a hand across his forehead. Again he ordered, "Bring her back." Emma hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with becoming the center of attention, but the handlers nodded. She stepped into the doorway once more. No commands. No gestures. No attempt to touch the animal. The dog's breathing slowed. Its ears lifted. The room seemed to exhale with it. "Impossible," one handler whispered. "He hasn't settled for anyone since extraction." Emma remained exactly where she was. Eyes calm, shoulders relaxed, never trying to take control. She watched the dog the way experienced nurses watched frightened patients. Without demanding trust, simply allowing space for it. For the first time in nearly an hour, the veterinarian managed to reconnect the four without another struggle. Relief flickered across several exhausted faces. It lasted less than 5 seconds. The dog suddenly lifted its head higher, ignoring every person around it, staring only at Emma as if waiting for something she hadn't done. Then it released a soft, unfamiliar whine that made its own handler go pale. "I've never heard him make that sound," he admitted quietly. Before anyone could ask another question, the automatic doors at the far end of the emergency entrance burst open under the weight of heavy boots. Hospital security instinctively turned toward the lobby. Outside, dark government SUVs rolled to a precise stop beneath the emergency canopy, their engines idling in perfect formation. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Uniformed personnel stepped aside without being asked. Emma hadn't even looked toward the entrance yet. She was still watching the dog. The Malinois, however, had already shifted its attention. Its ears stood straight. Its tail remained perfectly still. And for the first time since arriving at the hospital, it wasn't looking at its handler anymore. It was looking past Emma, toward whoever had just walked through those doors. Have you ever trusted someone before you could explain why? Nobody in the treatment bay moved as the heavy footsteps echoed closer, but Emma did not turn toward the entrance. Her attention stayed on the Malinois, whose breathing had become slower, steadier, almost synchronized with her own quiet rhythm. The chief veterinarian noticed it too. "Hold the sedation," he ordered. "Do not touch him yet." A younger doctor frowned immediately. "We finally have the intravenous line in. We cannot keep waiting. His temperature is still climbing." Emma spoke for the first time, her voice calm enough to be almost lost beneath the humming monitors. "If you push him now, he will pull the line again." Several heads turned toward her. The younger doctor folded his arms. "With respect, Nurse Carter, this is a military working dog, not one of your emergency room patients." Emma simply nodded and stepped half a pace farther back, refusing to argue. The veterinarian hesitated between protocol and instinct before signaling everyone to pause. 5 long seconds passed. The Malinois remained perfectly still. The room relaxed just enough for one technician to prepare the medication again. Then the younger doctor reached toward the syringe without waiting for another instruction. Before his hand came within a foot of the dog's shoulder, the animal's ears snapped forward and a low warning growl rolled through the room. Every muscle tightened again. "Stop," Emma said quietly. He ignored her. The instant his fingers brushed the tactical vest, the Malinois jerked sideways, ripping the freshly secured line free once again. Monitors chirped. Saline splashed across the floor. Two handlers rushed forward while the chief veterinarian slammed a palm against the table in frustration. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, the older veterinarian looked toward Emma instead of the younger doctor. "How did you know?" She glanced at the trembling animal rather than at him. "He warned us before he moved." The explanation sounded too simple to satisfy anyone. One handler slowly lowered his hands. "He did," he admitted. His ears changed first. The younger doctor looked unconvinced, but he said nothing this time. Emma bent carefully, picked up the fallen intravenous tubing without stepping closer to the dog, and handed it to the technician. As she straightened, the Malinois released that same soft whine again, softer now, almost questioning instead of frightened. The handler stared in disbelief. He only made that sound once before. He murmured, almost to himself. After, he stopped before finishing the sentence. Nobody asked why. Outside, the rumble of powerful engines faded into silence as vehicle doors closed one after another with practiced precision. Hospital security officers exchanged uncertain glances before instinctively clearing the hallway without receiving any order. Through the glass entrance, 5 men in civilian jackets moved with unmistakably military discipline, their pace neither hurried nor hesitant. They did not look toward the emergency department signs. They walked as if they already knew exactly where they were going. A receptionist stepped forward with a welcoming smile that vanished almost immediately when the tallest of the 5 quietly displayed a government credential. No voices were raised. No introductions were offered. Even from across the corridor, the change in the atmosphere reached the treatment bay. One nurse whispered, "Who are they?" Nobody answered. The chief veterinarian looked toward Emma, perhaps expecting recognition, but she appeared just as focused on the Malinois as before. Then something changed again. The dog slowly lifted its injured front paw and rested it against the edge of the table, eyes fixed beyond Emma toward the approaching footsteps. The handler swallowed hard. He is waiting for someone. Before another word could be spoken, the treatment room door opened, and the first of the 5 visitors stopped at the threshold, scanning every face except the dog, as though the animal had never been the reason they came. The tallest visitor had barely crossed the threshold when the Malinois lurched forward again, its muscles tightening as every handler instinctively reached for the leash. "Hold him," someone shouted, but the combined pressure only made the dog fight harder, forcing the intravenous line dangerously close to slipping out once more. Emma looked from the strained leash to the dog's fixed stare and realized everyone in the room was making the same mistake. "Please let the leash go slack," she said quietly. One handler stared at her as though she had suggested the impossible. "Absolutely not." The chief veterinarian hesitated, watching the animal's breathing accelerate again. Emma did not argue. She simply took one slow step sideways, placing herself where the dog could see both her and the open doorway without twisting its body. "If he has to choose between resisting you and watching the entrance, he will keep fighting," she said. "Give him one clear direction." The room fell silent for a heartbeat before the chief veterinarian made a difficult decision. "Ease the tension," he ordered. The handler reluctantly loosened his grip by only a few inches. The change was immediate. Instead of pulling harder, the Malinois settled onto all 4 paws, its eyes never leaving Emma. The growling disappeared. The leash hung loose without another struggle. Nobody spoke. A technician quietly reconnected the intravenous tubing, expecting another violent reaction that never came. The fluid began flowing steadily for the first time since the dog had entered the hospital. The younger doctor who had doubted Emma lowered his hands and stared at the monitor. The heart rate was still elevated but no longer climbing. "How?" he whispered before stopping himself. Emma never answered. She was already watching something else. The dog's ears shifted again, this time not toward her, but toward the hallway. It was listening long before anyone else heard the footsteps approaching. A second later, polished boots echoed outside the treatment room exactly where the animal had been looking. Several nurses exchanged uneasy glances. One of the handlers slowly removed his gloves, unable to hide the confusion on his face. "He usually reads rooms better than people," he murmured. "Today he is reading her." The chief veterinarian followed Emma's line of sight for the first time instead of watching the monitors. She was not looking at the visitors. She was studying the dog's posture, its breathing, the tiny movements of its eyes, noticing details everyone else had overlooked. Without asking permission, she quietly slid a folded blanket beneath the edge of the animal's injured leg to reduce the pressure caused by the metal table. The Malinois exhaled deeply, almost as if relieved. Another small sound escaped its throat, softer than before. The handler blinked in disbelief. "That is his reassurance signal," he said under his breath. "He only does that when he completely trusts someone." Nobody challenged him this time. The younger doctor glanced toward Emma with an expression that no longer carried skepticism but uncertainty, as though everything he believed about the situation had quietly shifted beneath his feet. Yet the greatest surprise was still waiting outside the room. The 5 visitors never looked at the medical charts, never asked about the dog's condition, and never introduced themselves. Instead, they scanned every face until the tallest among them stopped the instant his eyes reached Emma. His expression did not show recognition alone. It showed relief. Before anyone inside the treatment bay could understand why, he removed his gloves, took one deliberate step forward, and quietly asked a single question that froze the entire room. "Is Nurse Emma Carter still on duty?" The question hung in the treatment bay for only a second before every eye shifted toward Emma. She did not answer immediately because the Malinois suddenly lifted its head again, its breathing becoming uneven as another wave of tension swept through the room. The chief veterinarian looked from the dog to the unexpected visitors, then made a decision that changed the atmosphere entirely. "Stabilize him first," he said. "Nobody moves this patient." Emma stepped closer to the examination table, not to comfort the animal, but to watch the rhythm of its chest. She quietly adjusted the blanket beneath the injured leg by less than an inch, relieving pressure without disturbing the intravenous line. The change was subtle, yet the dog's heartbeat settled enough for the monitor to stop sounding intermittent alarms. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. But several military visitors exchanged quick glances as though they had just witnessed something familiar. The tallest among them noticed every movement Emma made. She never reached for the leash, never tried to dominate the dog. Every decision came before the animal reacted instead of after. He remained silent, studying her with growing concentration. One of the younger visitors leaned toward him and whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. The man answered with only a slight shake of his head, refusing to look away from Emma even once. Before anyone could ask another question, a trauma nurse rushed into the treatment bay, carrying an electronic tablet. "Trauma Bay 1 needs another registered nurse immediately," she called. "The commander is becoming unstable." The chief veterinarian instinctively looked toward Emma. So did half the room. The request created an impossible choice. If Emma left, the only person the dog appeared willing to trust would disappear. If she stayed, the trauma team upstairs would remain short during a critical moment. Emma did not hesitate for long. She turned toward the chief veterinarian instead of making the decision herself. "His intravenous line is finally secure," she said. "If everyone stays calm and nobody crowds him, he should tolerate the next phase." It was not certainty. It was the best judgment she could make with the information available. The chief veterinarian studied the dog for several long seconds before giving a reluctant nod. "Go." As Emma stepped away from the table, every handler watched for another outburst. Instead, the Malinois remained still, eyes following her without resisting. Relief spread through the room until something unexpected happened. The dog slowly lowered its head onto the blanket exactly where Emma had adjusted it moments before, refusing to look at anyone else. The handler quietly removed his grip from the leash altogether. Nobody had instructed him to do it. He simply realized he no longer needed to. The younger doctor who had challenged Emma earlier watched the scene in complete silence, his confidence replaced by questions he could not answer. The military visitors noticed that change as well. They had not come for the dog. Yet every unexpected detail surrounding Emma seemed to confirm something none of them was willing to say aloud. As Emma reached the hallway leading toward the trauma unit, she never looked back. The tallest visitor stepped aside instead of blocking her path, his expression calm but intensely focused. He did not introduce himself. He did not stop her. He simply watched as she disappeared toward Trauma Bay 1, then quietly turned to the others and gave a single, almost invisible nod. Without another word, all 5 men followed her down the corridor. Emma pushed through the doors of Trauma Bay 1 just as another monitor sounded a sharp warning. The trauma team had already surrounded the patient, but nobody was standing still. A senior physician was reviewing imaging, a respiratory therapist adjusted equipment, and 2 nurses prepared medications while a Navy officer watched every movement from the corner of the room. The injured commander remained conscious, yet every passing second narrowed the team's margin for error. Emma did not step into the center of the room. She stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the monitors, the patient's color, the positioning of every line, and the rhythm of the people instead of the rhythm of the machines. Then she quietly noticed something everyone else had missed. One intravenous line had begun flowing slower than expected because the patient's arm had shifted during transport. She crossed the room without interrupting anyone, carefully repositioned the arm, and secured the tubing before the flow stopped completely. The correction took only seconds, yet the monitor immediately steadied. Nobody celebrated. The attending physician simply looked toward Emma with brief surprise before returning to the patient. The crisis had not ended. It had only changed shape. The Navy officer near the wall watched Emma more closely now, his expression tightening as though another small piece of a puzzle had quietly fallen into place. Instead of lingering beside the bed after solving the immediate problem, Emma stepped aside to give the trauma physician room to work. Most people trying to impress others would have stayed where everyone could see them. She disappeared into the edge of the room, already preparing supplies the team would likely need next before anyone requested them. One nurse reached for the exact instrument Emma had already placed within reach and paused in visible surprise. "Thank you," she whispered almost automatically before realizing she had never asked for it. Across the room, the commander briefly opened his eyes. His gaze wandered through the crowded trauma bay before stopping on Emma for less than a second. There was no recognition in his face, only the faintest sign that her presence somehow eased the tension around him. Before anyone could think about that strange moment, another alarm interrupted the room. The patient's blood pressure dipped unexpectedly, forcing the attending physician into a difficult decision. They could move immediately toward the next stage of treatment, risking unnecessary instability, or spend precious minutes improving circulation first while delaying everything else. Neither option was ideal. Emma quietly glanced at the monitor, then toward the patient's hands. His fingertips remained warmer than the number suggested. She said only one sentence. "Please verify the cuff before changing the treatment plan." The room paused. The physician looked irritated for half a heartbeat, then nodded to another nurse. The blood pressure cuff was repositioned. A fresh reading appeared almost instantly. The previous measurement had been inaccurate because the cuff had shifted during the transfer. The room exhaled together. A major intervention had nearly been launched because of faulty information. Nobody said Emma had saved the situation. Nobody needed to. The attending physician simply looked at her differently now, not with admiration but with professional trust. Along the observation window outside the trauma bay, the 5 military visitors stood perfectly still. None of them spoke. They simply watched Emma anticipate problems before they became emergencies, moving with calm discipline that felt strangely familiar. The tallest among them slowly removed a weathered challenge coin from his pocket, turning it once between his fingers before quietly closing his hand again. He had clearly expected to find someone. He had not expected to find this. Then, for the first time since entering the hospital, he stepped away from the observation glass and walked directly toward the trauma bay doors, his eyes never leaving Emma as he reached for the handle. The tallest visitor reached the trauma bay door just as the commander's oxygen level began to fall. Emma saw the change before the alarm fully sounded. She moved to the bedside, checked the tubing, then looked at the commander's face instead of the monitor. "He is tiring," she said. The attending physician nodded and ordered preparations for airway support. Emma opened the equipment tray, but her hand stopped over the standard setup. She chose a smaller backup device and placed it beside the primary one. The respiratory therapist glanced at her. "Why that size?" Emma did not answer. She adjusted the commander's head by a fraction and exposed an old surgical scar beneath his jaw. The therapist's expression changed. "Restricted airway," he murmured. The primary device met resistance seconds later. No panic followed. Emma placed the backup into the physician's hand before he asked, and the team secured the airway without losing more time. The room steadied, but the cost arrived immediately. The attending physician turned to Emma. "You stay with us." It was not praise. It was responsibility. Outside the glass, one of the 5 men looked toward the scar, then toward Emma, as if he understood why she had noticed it. The tallest visitor entered without interrupting the team. A worn challenge coin remained closed inside his fist. When Emma reached for tape, her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal a narrow pale mark around her wrist, too straight to be accidental. His eyes dropped to it, and hardened with recognition, he refused to voice. Emma pulled the sleeve down and continued working. The commander stirred beneath sedation, one hand moving weakly toward the edge of the bed. Emma caught it before it struck the rail. Her thumb pressed once against the center of his palm. The movement was small, practiced, almost invisible. His hand relaxed. The Navy officer in the corner stared at that gesture longer than he had stared at any monitor. Then he quietly removed his cap. The crisis seemed contained until a trauma nurse entered with an update from the veterinary bay. The Malinois had begun refusing treatment again the moment Emma disappeared from sight. Its heart rate was rising, and the surgical window was narrowing. Emma now faced the choice nobody else could make for her. Stay beside the commander, where the trauma team had begun relying on her judgment, or return to the dog before its condition worsened. The attending physician looked at the stable airway, then at Emma. "We can manage here for now," he said, but his tone revealed no certainty. Emma studied the commander, checked the medication pumps, and gave the nurse 3 precise instructions for changes that might occur during transport preparation. Then she stepped away from the bed. The tallest visitor moved aside, allowing her to pass, but spoke for the first time in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "You still choose the one nobody else can reach." Emma stopped for half a second. No denial. No question. She continued toward the door. Behind her, the commander's fingers closed around empty air as though remembering that same pressure in his palm. The Navy officer near the wall looked from him to Emma, then reached into a sealed personal effects bag delivered with the patient. Inside was a weathered metal tag bearing a faded symbol identical to the edge of the challenge coin in the visitor's hand. The 2 men saw it at the same moment. Neither spoke. But as Emma reached the corridor, the tallest visitor opened his fist, studied the matching emblem, and followed her toward the military working dog, knowing the next room would make silence impossible. Emma reached the veterinary bay as the Malinois tore free from the hands trying to restrain it, the intravenous line bending under the sudden pull. The surgical team had less than 10 minutes before the delay became dangerous. She did not call the dog's name. She stepped into its line of sight, lowered one hand beside her thigh, and pressed her thumb once into her palm. The same signal she had used beside the commander. The Malinois froze. Its ears lifted. Then it crossed the room without a command and placed its head beneath her waiting hand. Emma knelt, accepted the risk of staying within reach, and guided its weight onto the blanket without forcing the injured leg. The veterinarian secured the line, administered the medication, and watched the monitors settle. Surgery could proceed. Only then did the tallest visitor step forward. He opened his hand, revealing the weathered challenge coin. The faded emblem matched the metal tag recovered from the commander's belongings. Emma looked at it once, and the color left her face. "Commander Ryan Brooks," she said softly. It was the first time she had named him. Ryan's posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for every person in the room to understand that the quiet nurse had addressed him as someone who had known his rank before he entered the building. One of the other men placed a worn medical pouch on the counter. Inside lay an old field dressing marked with the same symbol and the letters E. Carter. The handler looked from the pouch to the dog resting beneath Emma's hand. "He was assigned to the team that disappeared 8 years ago," he said. Ryan did not explain further. He did not need to. The scar around Emma's wrist, the signal in the commander's palm, the dog's recognition, and the way 5 Navy SEALs had crossed the hospital to find her had already formed the truth. Ryan lowered his voice. Petty Officer Emma Carter, Special Operations Medical Specialist. The room went still, but Emma did not rise. The Malinois had begun slipping deeper under sedation, and its breathing changed. She immediately shifted her attention back to the present. His airway is narrowing, she said. The veterinary surgeon moved closer, but Emma was already repositioning the dog's head and clearing the team's access. Her identity had surfaced, yet the responsibility in front of her mattered more. Ryan stepped back without being asked, and the other 4 men followed, giving her the space they would have given an officer in command. The veterinarian secured the airway, then nodded once. The dog was stable enough for transport. As the table began rolling towards surgery, the Malinois opened its eyes for a final moment and pressed its muzzle weakly into Emma's palm. She kept walking beside it until the operating room doors closed. When she finally turned, all 5 SEALs were standing in a straight line. No applause, no speeches. Ryan simply raised his hand in a formal salute. One by one, the others did the same. Emma's eyes moved past them toward the corridor leading back to Trauma Bay 1. A nurse appeared at the far end, breathless. "The commander is awake," she said. "He is asking for the medic who brought his team home." Emma looked once at the closed operating room doors, then toward the trauma unit, knowing that answering him would force the last part of her past into the open. Emma did not answer the salute. She was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1. Behind her, Ryan lowered his hand first, and the other 4 followed without a word. The younger doctor stepped aside before she reached the doors, no longer guarding his place at the center of the room. Inside, the commander lay awake beneath the steady glow of the monitors. Emma checked the airway tubing, the medication pumps, and the color returning to his hands before she met his eyes. He tried to speak. She placed 2 fingers lightly against his wrist, asking him to save his strength without saying it. His gaze dropped to the pale mark beneath her sleeve, then to the pressure of her thumb against his palm. Recognition moved across his face slowly. He closed his fingers around hers once. That was all. Across the room, the attending physician adjusted the treatment plan Emma had prepared instead of replacing it with his own. A nurse quietly moved the supplies closer before Emma reached for them. Nobody praised her. They simply began working the way she had worked from the beginning. Calmly, carefully, leaving room for the patient instead of crowding the fear. A call came from the operating suite. The Malinois was stable after surgery, but waking restless, refusing to settle for the recovery staff. Emma looked at the commander. He released her hand before she could make the choice aloud. The attending physician nodded toward the door. "We have him." She left without waiting for anyone to notice. In the recovery area, the dog lay beneath a warm blanket, eyes open, breathing uneven. The handler stood several feet away, holding the leash loose rather than tight. When Emma entered, he did not issue a command. He stepped back and placed the leash gently into her open hand. The Malinois watched her cross the room. She lowered herself beside the recovery mat, careful of the surgical dressing, and rested her palm where the animal could reach it. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the dog lifted its head with visible effort and pressed its muzzle into her hand, exactly as it had before the operating room doors closed. Emma's shoulders finally dropped. Around them, the room became still. Ryan remained at the doorway, the weather challenge coin resting against his closed fingers. The chief veterinarian dimmed the overhead lights. The younger doctor silently silenced a non-essential alarm before it could disturb the dog. One by one, the people who had once tried to control the room chose instead to protect its quiet. The Malinois shifted closer until its head rested against Emma's knee. Its eyes closed. The same animal that had refused every command now slept beneath the hand of the only person who had never demanded obedience. Emma stayed there until its breathing deepened. When she finally rose, she found the old medical pouch on the chair beside her, cleaned and carefully repaired. Ryan had left the challenge coin inside, but there was no note. Emma closed the pouch and returned it to him as she passed. He accepted it with both hands. Before she stepped into the corridor, the dog released one soft, familiar whine. Emma turned. Its eyes remained closed, but one paw had stretched toward the empty space where she had been sitting. She walked back, placed the folded blanket beneath it by less than an inch, and the paw relaxed. Then the quiet nurse returned to her shift while the hallway behind her remained silent enough to hear the Malinois sleeping. The emergency department sounded exactly as it had the evening before. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Monitors chimed in steady rhythms. Families waited with tired eyes. New patients arrived carrying worries that had nothing to do with military operations or forgotten missions. Emma Carter walked through the same hallway with the same clipboard she had quietly set down when everything had begun. She stopped beside an elderly woman struggling to fasten a hospital blanket around her shoulders and gently tucked the corners beneath her arms before continuing toward the next room. No one announced her arrival. No one cleared a path. The work simply continued. Across the department, the younger doctor who had once dismissed her paused beside a frightened child waiting for stitches. Instead of rushing through the explanation, he lowered himself to one knee, slowed his voice, and waited until the child nodded before beginning. Nearby, the chief veterinarian entered carrying fresh reports from the recovery unit. The Malinois had eaten a small meal, accepted medication without resistance, and slept through the night. He folded the report instead of filing it immediately and quietly left a copy on Emma's workstation before walking away without interrupting her patient. Down the corridor, Ryan Brooks stood outside Trauma Bay 1, wearing clean civilian clothes instead of a hospital gown. His movements were careful but steady. He watched Emma finish changing a bandage for a construction worker before she even noticed him standing there. When she finally looked up, neither of them spoke. Ryan reached into his pocket, removed the repaired medical pouch, and placed it on the counter. The Weather Challenge coin remained inside. Emma looked at it for only a moment before sliding the pouch gently back toward him. He accepted the quiet answer with a faint smile, zipped it closed, and carried it away. The hallway between them needed nothing else. Later that afternoon, the Malinois was led outside for its first slow walk after surgery. The handler carried the leash loosely, allowing the dog to choose its own pace. As they passed the hospital entrance, the dog stopped. It turned toward the glass doors, ears lifting just as they had on the first day. Emma happened to be crossing the lobby with fresh supplies balanced against one arm. She never called the dog. She simply looked up. The Malinois gave one soft whine, gently wagged its tail once, then continued walking beside its handler without hesitation. The leash remained loose all the way across the sidewalk. Evening settled over the hospital, and another shift began. Emma hung a fresh identification badge around her neck, picked up a clean clipboard, and answered the next call light before anyone else reached it. Outside, the last sunlight reflected across the emergency entrance where the government vehicles had once stood. There was nothing unusual there now. Only patients arriving, nurses hurrying through automatic doors, and another ordinary night waiting to be lived. Inside one treatment room, a folded blanket rested beneath a frightened patient's arm exactly where it eased the pressure most. Emma adjusted it by less than an inch, offered a quiet, reassuring smile, and moved on to the next person who needed her. Somewhere beyond the walls, a military working dog finally slept without fear. Somewhere inside the hospital, 5 Navy SEALs carried home a story they would never need to explain. And in the bright silence of another ordinary shift, the quiet nurse kept doing what she had always done, proving one gentle choice at a time that some bonds are stronger than commands.